what I want to talk about right sort of off the bat is Dungeon Master delegation. Putting your players to work for you, especially during the sessions. Paint a small picture for you, see if you guys can feel some shared experience with that. So it takes a lot of time and energy to be a Dungeon Master. It's not just sort of like the prep between sessions, but all the plate spinning we often do in each session. For a player, a session is usually pretty relaxing. You don't have to do too much. We all enjoy doing it. It's fun. It's why we show up to play with our friends and roll some dice and do some cool things as characters and solve an adventure, get some loot, etc., etc. But that doesn't take a lot of work per session. Really, there's not too much as a player that's really splitting your focus among a lot of other things. And that's really juxtaposed to somebody like the Dungeon Master who's sitting behind the screen. We have a ton of things that are kind of going on. Like, we're taking care of our monsters, we got our traps, our hazards, our obstacles. We're interpreting what our players say correctly when they're throwing wild ideas at us and listening to them and trying to make sure that they have a good, fun time, that they're challenged, they're getting what they want sort of out of the game. And I certainly have fun running games. I'm not saying that I hate running games. I enjoy running games a lot. I also really enjoy sort of building out the world and doing all the world building. I enjoy this sort of extra piece, that DLC content you get for D&D, which is essentially in between sessions where I get to prep adventures and build out the world and check with NPCs and make surprises for my friends and do all that fun stuff. So there is a lot of cool stuff to it, and I really, really love it. But I do have to say that being a DM is probably more work, especially at the table, than it is relaxing. Or at least maybe it is for me. Let me know if that's sort of your experience with it. As I was thinking about it, it's like, let's just take a sort of a quick inventory of some of the things the DMs have to sort of keep track of during a session. Initiative, battle maps, dungeon maps, keeping track of things like concentration checks, magic items both that we're trying to have in the dungeons and that we're trying to give out to players, and making sure that we know that there are opportunities for them to use those items that are going to be important, or that they just have those items to begin with. I don't know how many times, but I think this is a very common Dungeon Master, Game Master thing that happens where we have an item, we give it to our players, forget about it for X number of sessions, and then we throw out a threat and they happen to have that one perfect item that just completely neutralizes a threat or some sort of obstacle, and we're like, oh, right, yeah, no, I totally did give that to you, and I did not remember that, and I was expecting that to take maybe like 20 minutes for you guys to sort of figure out how to get around. Knocked it out of the park like that. So now I'm kind of on my back foot trying to figure out what I'm going to do to fill some of the time for the session, or if I'm going to have to end up cutting it short. Other things, conditions, ongoing effects, concentration check, timekeeping, both in-game and for the session length, and what's kind of going on in the campaign lore, miniatures, terrain, session notes. If you do any sort of atmosphere like music, lights, sound effects, handouts, all that sort of tactile stuff, you're usually the person, when you're the Dungeon Master, you're organizing the play, making sure that people can come next time that we're going to play is, and what time, and for how long, and where we're going to play, doing all that stuff. So this list sort of continues on, like more and more and more, and so much of that burden rests, sort of squarely on our shoulders as a Dungeon Master. That's a lot, right? And a lot of that is more than just rolling dice and the actual sort of minutia of just the game ongoing. Now, certainly there's plenty of that, but there's a lot of the stuff that's sort of around that we have to keep track of on top of that. So what if we could, like, maybe get a little bit of help, especially during sessions? As a person who is a professional, who's in the workforce, been working in it for a while, I think any seasoned sort of working professional knows we can't do it all. Especially anybody that's been a small business owner or worked in a small business understands that as it grows out, there's this tendency to be like, well, I've always done it, so I must always do it. But our cup runneth over when it comes to a bunch of responsibilities. So we kind of need to look for some solutions that are easy to implement, that we can kind of utilize our friends, because remember, in most D&D games, we have other people at the table, and we can actually use some things like delegation to parcel out just small things to different people, to give them a little bit something extra to do and take a little bit of that off our plates. Probably the biggest ones, I think, is that this amount of plate spinning, all these extra things that we need to keep track of and do, is often an overlooked source of Dungeon Master or Game Master burnout. Like, yes, it's, of course, there's the prepping and running campaigns and getting bored with a campaign, which often I think is more the case than actual burnout as a dungeon master. There's just so much to do. And there's this feeling that the funnel always kind of comes down to the dungeon master. But we can actually delegate a few things, and if we delegate a few things out, we can sort of lighten our own load, give us a little bit of breathing room, and that gives us the ability to have more time. We're going to have more energy. We can spend more attention on sort of making our D&D sessions more engrossing for ourselves and for our players. Is kind of give us that breathing space to have better games. That's a lot of talk, but how do we actually do that thing? What is the thing, and how are we going to do it? So I think assigning each of your players one or more responsibilities, roles, whatever you want to call them, assigning them something that they can do, that they are responsible with, and I think that this has an added benefit both for the players and for us to actually be in the game instead of thinking about the game. I think it's really easy for players to get there. Sometimes I think it's a little bit more difficult for GMs or DMs to get there, especially in every session, because we have all these little spinning plays. For example, our brains are really kind of bad at multitasking. If we reduce the pool of things that we need to spend our energy reserves on, we have this ability to make each session and adventure and campaign more creative and more fulfilling for everyone to play, not just our players, but for ourselves as well. Let's offload some responsibility. Now, there is sort of a preface for doing that. And first is you're going to have to trust your players to take care of some things. You're going to have to relinquish a bit of control over your game. So if you have a stranglehold on that control, just kind of relax a little bit and start small. So start small by doling out what seems the most insignificant things to you personally as a dungeon master or game master. If you don't have those sort of control issues, don't give them everything, because if you give them everything, they're going to be fully overloaded. But you can start doling out things that you think are more important to the game, but maybe not as personally important to you. You have to trust your players. So, when you're relinquishing that control, your players have the opportunity to lie about the game, to cheat about the game, to steal things in the game. They can do all sorts of skullduggery. For me, the follow-up question is, if you think that could be an issue, why are you playing a collaborative game with these people if you feel like you can't trust them? Well, if you're playing with a group or running for a group that you can't really trust, it seems like you have sort of a different issue you might want to start to address. And you might start to try to get to the bottom of why I can't trust them. And once you get there, maybe we can make some assumptions about that. Because we're assuming that you have a table full of friends who all want to have a good time together. If that's the case, great. These are going to work for you. If that's not the case, it's going to be kind of difficult. And the first instance of that kind of jumps to my mind is playing with randos on the internet. And that's where I feel like the most experienced firsthand and heard secondhand or third-hand accounts of horror stories, especially when it comes to TTRPG groups, is that people playing with randos online. The people who are playing with a bunch of randos online, and that's their main form of playing something like D&D, is that because anyone who knows them won't play with them. And that's not just because they don't have people around them who don't want to play D&D, which they may or may not, but it's because they're the dreaded that guy. And so if you have that guy, and then if you're playing with a bunch of randos online, you may be playing with an entire group of those guys. Probably don't want to trust them. You know what? I don't know their character. You've played with them. You decide whether you want to trust them or not. I don't think I would. Right off bat, I would have to learn a little bit more about them before I would feel comfortable sort of delegating out things like that, knowing that they're not going to lie, cheat, and steal their way through the game and kind of lessen the experience for everybody else around the table. We're going to jump in. We're going to kind of talk about some different roles that you can kind of assign out, dole out to your different players. So you can have a little bit more of that improv. You can have a little bit more time and energy to think about the specifics of what's happening inside the game instead of just the base framework of facilitating the game. All right, so number one, I made a list, but I didn't put them in any sort of specific order. It's an unordered list. There's no priority to any of those, so you choose whichever ones feel like the easiest for you to let go of, or the easiest for your players to sort of implement as we're playing. The mapper. It's been my experience that usually when you're playing at a table, at least in person, somebody around that table, it's clear who has probably the better art skills. That might be the person you want to assign as mapper. That's the person who sort of draws the battle maps, and if you want to play that play style, maps the dungeons, which can be another fun thing to add to your game if you're not doing a type of game already where the players are not on the hook for remembering how to get in and out of the dungeon and where things are. These roles help keep players engaged in the game when it's not their turn, when they don't have something to do. So if there's somebody else who's doing a scene or whatever, you have the mapper who's looking back over the dungeon map as they're scrolling it out. Like, okay, we went up here and there was crossroads and went left and there, and it circles back. Okay, I wonder where the right place goes. So we still need to investigate that. So they're doing that, and they're maybe talking with other players at the table about, okay, where do we want to maybe go next? And so they can do that when another, the rogue's off checking for traps and unlocking a treasure chest or whatever they're doing. One of those one-on-one or one-on-two interactions where the rest of the table's not really doing anything except sitting around. Pulled multiple games throughout my life, especially in person when you have a flip map or a Chessex battle map or something like that, and the team has to get up and like draw out the room. Now, if you've ever sat at a full table, you know that there's not really any space for that person to stand to do that if they can't reach it from where they're at. And if you're the dungeon master, usually you're kind of at head of the table and you need to draw the map. The map's probably beyond arm's reach. You have to get up and go walk around to sort of the side of the table where other people are sitting and trying to get in their way and trying to reach over their stuff and do that. Well, if you have that sort of mapper person, take a picture of the actual map itself and send it via text or make a copy of it, whatever, so that way you don't show them all the secret information or any of the stat blocks that are for the map, and you can just kind of give them the map and be like, hey, can you draw this out? You don't have to rely on your own maybe questionable art skills. You can rely on whoever's the best artist at the table to draw it out for you. And you can instead spend your time getting ready for whatever's actually in that room, whether that's an encounter or reading over the traps or the hazards, or, if they have a dialogue with some NPC, you can look over those notes, make sure that you're hitting all the things that you need to hit. The 1,000 other things that are going on, that could be going on in this room, you can focus on those as the dungeon master or game master, and you can let your friend over here just be the person who draws the map. That's all they need to do. The second one is probably the most common, and that is the initiative monkey. There's no reason as Dungeon Master we really need to be tracking initiative. Each Dungeon Master or Game Master is different. Some like to keep the initiative order really secretive, but if you're not playing an old school D&D style game where you're re-rolling initiative every round, people are going to know where they are in initiative. So it's easier to just give it to somebody else to track. And usually when I do that, I don't tell them what the monsters are. Bad stuff goes on 11, and bad stuff 2 goes on 9. And let somebody else take care of that, and then you have a player who's in charge of, okay, it's your turn, you're on deck, they can keep track of all those things, and then they get down to the bottom, top, because I think most layer actions go on initiative 20, and you can be like, oh, it's time for the layer action, what is the layer action? Or is the end of the round, does any sort of special thing happen? And you can give them those cues. But it is probably the first thing that I'll hand off if I'm running and I feel like I've got a bunch of other stuff to do. I'll be like, you take care of the initiative. After that is the HP tracker. And this is another thing that I've seen a lot of people do, that you can actually offload tracking monster hit points instead, and the number of monsters remaining. You can actually give that off to a player and they can tally up damage. So you don't have to give them the total HP if you want. You just give them the damage that's being done, and they just count up from that. So they start at 0 and they get up to the full total HP of the monster, and then you tell them, well, that monster's dead. And that's an easy way to sort of take things off your plate. Now, the other thing that I might do is that, because I do things like morale and check things like that, and a lot of that is based off of hitting maybe 50% of your hit points, I'll often be checking in with that person. I might go, how much damage have they taken? And I'll look at the stat block. Be like, okay, that's That's not quite half their hit points, so they're good this round, but next round I'm probably going to have to start making morale saves for them. Luckily, in something like 5e or D&D 2024, unlike something like 4th edition, we don't have abilities that proc off of being bloodied or hitting 50% of your hit points, so there's not really a concern for that. After that is probably one of the things that I need to use more, and I don't do a super great job of, is condition and concentration trackers. You need somebody who keeps track of the active conditions that are going on for PCs and monsters, any sort of ongoing effects that are on the battlefield, and helps both me and the players keep track of things like concentration checks and make sure that we're doing them, because I know I am not great at it. We've been playing 5th edition for a decade now, and I'm still not good about concentration checks, both as a player and the dungeon master. I often forget about them, and then sometime after my turn, I'm like, oh crap, I need to make a concentration check. I got hit this turn. That's a nice, easy one to throw out. I have some rings for concentration checks, so if you play with miniatures, you can throw down the ring. That can be helpful as well if you want that visual aid. You're in charge of keeping track of the conditions on the battlefield. That's your one job, in addition to taking care of your character on your turn. And like I said, a lot of these jobs have this sort of secondary benefit. Primary benefit, of course, is getting stuff off your plate as a dungeon master, so you can focus more on the actual game. But the second part is that if you give a player a different role, they have something they can actually do in between their turns. So they're not just sitting around waiting for the opportunity to maybe use a reaction. Now they're like, I need to actually pay attention to everybody's turn, because I need to know if they cast a concentration spell, if they lose their concentration. The monster now has I don't know, Hunter's Mark on it. Now this one has Fairy Fire on it. This one, there's a spiritual weapon. I need to put a spiritual weapon out on the board. Those sorts of things. Just kind of give them one person who's in charge of that. So if you have players that also have some engagement problems where they struggle to kind of stay in tune, especially, which is very easy to do, especially during battle, where sometimes it can be 10 minutes or more in between sort of turns as a player. Giving them a reason that they need to pay attention to, that they're actually doing in between their turns, can actually be really, really helpful as far as the engagement side. In addition to conditions and concentration check, keepers or trackers or whatever you want to call them, is a Timekeeper. A Timekeeper has the ability to track in-game rounds for spells that are round-based or abilities that are round-based. The person who keeps track of minutes, hours, days. I would probably even give them weather if you want to track weather for the game. This is the person who sort of keeps track of things inside of the game world and keeps that kind of going. And also, the Timekeeper is the person that I would trust to keep track of time of the session itself. Because I'm really bad at this when I run a game, is that I'm really bad at being like, let's take a break, which is not great when you're running 4, 6, 7, 8 hours and being like, I always just kind of want to keep going. That's sort of my MO, is that I just kind of like get in the zone and I just kind of want to go. So it's really helpful to have somebody be like, actually, can we take like a 15-minute bio break? It's been like 3 hours. Everybody needs drinks and chips and to use the bathroom and check emails and text or whatever. And I also like it because one of the things that I also might task this person with is letting me know when we're approaching the end of the session. If you've ever seen anybody sort of give a speech or any sort of public presentation, usually there's somebody in the audience who has a card that's like, hey, you have this much time left. And I want that as a DM to be like, hey, you've got an hour left in the session, you've got 30 minutes left in the session, maybe don't start something new and big because we don't have that much time left. So you need to start thinking about getting a way to close out the session, get us to a point where we can close out the session and not open up a new can of worms, and then we end up running, an hour and a half over. If you say you're going to play from this time, it's important to kind of stick within that ratio, because people like to do stuff outside of D&D and TTRPGs. I know, it's crazy to me. I've never considered it until now. People sometimes want the rest of their day and or evening back. So you want to make sure that you're kind of stay slotted in that time slot, which the Timekeeper can be really helpful for. I don't know the number of games I played in where I was going to expect to be done by 9, 10, 11, and before I know it, we in the session, I look up at my phone and it's 1:30 in the morning and I'm like, ugh, and I gotta get up early tomorrow. No. gonna lose a lot of sleep. I'm gonna be super tired. It goes like that unless we put something sort of in place to make sure that doesn't happen. The next one, so we had somebody who's tracking time. Now we need, and this is probably the one that comes up probably the most often because I feel like parties naturally gravitate to this anyways. But having a quartermaster or treasurer, one person at the table who keeps track of all the consumables, all the treasure you pick up, the roster of hirelings, anything that's a sort of a group resource, that you have one person in the group that just kind of tracks that. But it does save a lot of time at the table. I have played with some groups in some games that are like, well, the moment that we get loot, we try to divide it up. And so every time you come across something, some sort of treasure, there then becomes a 10-minute discussion, 5 to 10-minute discussion about, okay, can we split this up evenly between people? If we can't, if we picked up like an item, we determine who that item goes to right now. If we can't determine who that is or who's going to hold on to it right now, rather than just being like, there's one person, they are the quartermaster and treasurer, they hold all the stuff, and when we get done with the adventure and we get back to town or whatever our safe haven is, we're doling out the treasure. Here's this, who wanted this, does anybody need the extra healing potion? Who wants to hold that? Who wants the scroll of spider climb and all that sort of stuff? Rather than stopping the game every time you come across treasure to dole out treasure, which can really, really slow a game down. We have the quartermaster and treasurer. We have somebody who keeps track of time. We have somebody who keeps track of goods and people. Now, and the last one is somebody who keeps track of the lore. The lore keeper. This is the person who kind of creates the glossary for the campaign. So somebody who just tracks the NPCs, the MacGuffin items, the locations, our sort of missions and hooks. The person who collects and holds on to all the player handouts, anything that we get like that. So they're not necessarily taking notes. That's actually the session secretary's job if you want to give that to somebody. Some groups have somebody who is dedicated to taking notes of the session. Some groups are just like, well, everybody just takes their own notes. But I think it's really useful to have somebody who's like a lore keeper. Who's like, all I do is basically create a glossary for the campaign. So anytime that people are looking back at their notes and being like, okay, who was Reshlin again? And the lore keeper could be like, okay, Reshlin. Reshlin is this NPC. We talked to them last in this town, and they're attached to this adventure last time we talked to them, and they have this stuff going on. And that's all they need to keep track of. I don't need like the full, we talked to them in session 23, we talked to them about their family, and we got this item from them. No, I just need to know sort of the bullet points when I feel like we always run across that in a campaign where you have a name or a place or a thing, and you're like, I just can't remember what that was attached to. Tendon that attaches all these disparate nouns in our campaigns together, which can be really helpful to have somebody like a lore keeper to do. And it's also helpful for me as a dungeon master because I am not immune to forgetting things about my own games. Being like, Reshlin, I have no clue who Reshlin was. Or where we met him. I want to say this town. Does that sound familiar to people? And you don't really want to do that most of the time. If you can help it as a dungeon master, be like, I don't remember what's happening in my own game. So having somebody like a lore keeper and be like, hey, can you read the entry of Reshlin to everybody at the table? Just having somebody who can help with those little bits. And you can do that however you want. Maybe they take notes. Maybe it's Google Sheets. Maybe they make a Notion or some sort of wiki for it. And then, of course, if you're using anything like that, there are secret sections in there that only you as the DM can see. So you don't have to worry about the players accidentally stumbling across information they're not supposed to know. After that, I have what I'm calling sort of the minis Wrangler and Crafter, who keeps and retrieves your miniatures. This is also, and I feel like a lot of groups have this, they have the person who's most likely to buy or kit bash and paint miniatures in the group. I feel like most groups have one of those people, the crafty type. They probably have, or they're willing to make terrain and miniatures. Oftentimes they're people who are willing to make sort of handouts for you as well. So if you're like, oh, I want to do an invite to this gala that I want to send to the player characters, you kind of give that assignment over to your crafter and be like, hey, before the next game, would you be willing to make us a little invite for this gala? I'm going to give you some basic information, and then you can just draft it up and do it however you want. And they're going to run off to Hobby Lobby or Michael's or whatever craft store and get the materials, some stamps, and Maybe they're going to tea stain some pages, they're going to write it out by hand, maybe they'll type it out and print it out. But if you have somebody who really likes to do that sort of stuff, then that's somebody you might look at and be like, hey, I'm going to put you in charge of doing the handouts, because I want to use handouts for the campaign because they're nice, help with the immersion, people like them, and then once we're done with it, we can hand it off to the lore keeper, and the lore keeper can keep it. And then we'll have access to it whenever we need to know something about that. It's great to give them something that they feel like they can be like, hey, this is something cool that you can do for the campaign that's outside of the time, and give them some, what is essentially D&D homework. Be like, hey, by next session, could you have a miniature made up for this person, or start working for, maybe we know that we're doing this adventure with this dragon. We don't know when we're going to fight the dragon. It's definitely not going to be next session, but do you think that you could work on putting together the miniature for it? Or I'm going to need some like crumbling columns and stuff like that. Can you bring some of that stuff for the next session? Everybody's busy, so you have to be careful with those requests. You can't request a whole bunch of stuff and be like, and I need it next week or you're out of the game. As much forethought as you can give them, as much warning is always best. And after that, I put down the dungeon jockey. This is the person who's the DJ. They're in control of the music. They're the person who sets the lights if you want to control lights in your game. They do sound effects if you're using some sort of sound effects board. They're also the person who's in charge of the smells if you're the sort of group that uses incense or candles to kind of help set the scenes and things like that. You have somebody who's basically the person who's in charge of creating the atmosphere for the group. Now, I feel like this is becoming more and more of a thing. I felt earlier in my D&D playing experience, that really wasn't a thing. But especially now, as more and more digital tools and the internet has become a more pervasive part of everybody's game, we have the ability to, there's no reason to not really have background music kind of going on. A dimmer, or maybe we have like some little RGB light that we can kind of set out that maybe casts a different hue over things. Having the ability to pull in one of the many sound effects boards that are out there. The crackle of a campfire to do things like that, and bring in candles that, some pine smelling candles or things like that for wilderness exploration. Keep people a little bit more locked in on what's going on at the table. I have the XP tracker. Instead of me keeping track of things like level ups as a dungeon master, that's one of the things that I often want to shovel off to somebody else. You take care of this. I don't really care that much when you guys level up, as long as you are adequate power for the type of adventuring that you're doing. So if you are playing an XP based game, this is the person who keeps track of the XP and tells everybody when it's time to level up, who helps the dungeon master know when to level up, especially if you're not using straight XP to track how many sessions it's been since we leveled up. So having somebody who tracks that, trying to be like, hey, when was the last time we leveled up? How many sessions has it been since we leveled up? And they'll be like, oh, well, we missed some dates, and it's only been like 3 sessions. I'll be like, okay, it's only been 3 sessions. All right, we can probably squeeze out a few more before we level up. Or I turn to them and ask them, and they're like, it's been like 7 sessions. I'm just like, okay, well, all right, maybe we should think about leveling up the next opportunity. Then that kind of makes sense. Somebody who's going to help me keep track of that part of the game, which is really helpful, especially for me, because it's not a part of the game that I think about a whole lot. They can take care of it. I don't have to think about it. It makes my life easier. It could make your life easier. Maybe you want to keep that under wraps. It's kind of up to you. But that's definitely one of the things that I would shuffle off. And then, one of the things that almost always falls on the DM, but it's definitely one of the things that could fall on really anybody in the group, is have somebody who's in charge of scheduling play. The play scheduler. This is the person who keeps track of when and where games will be played. And who's going to show up to those games. When I'm running, I don't usually run out of my home. It's really difficult to be the person who is in charge of scheduling play when I don't have control over any of the elements of when and where we play, except my own attendance. If I'm looking for somebody to take over a duty like this in the group, it's usually whoever's place we play at most often. I feel like most D&D games generally play, or most groups kind of play at 1 or 2 spots. One of those spots is at least a player's or dungeon master's home. And having that person be like, okay, you're in charge of the play scheduling, because most often it's going to come down to, is your home going to be available? So having that person kind of track that, and then as a DM, I only need to worry about prepping the game, and I don't have to worry about as much about when and where we're going to actually play the game and who's going to be there. Letting somebody else be in charge of, be the person who has to run around and poke the other people in our group to be like, hey, are we playing this week? Where are we playing now? What time are we playing? Hey, talking to you. So instead, I can focus on doing the prep work for the game and start trying to think about, is anybody actually going to show up? Let somebody else deal with that. And then, even if I prep the game, if I finish prepping and then I jump in, the group text or Discord or however it is that you track your play, I can jump in there and be like, oh, I guess we're not playing this week. Well, that's fine. I've already prepped for the next time we play. If that's next week or whatever. So now I can go do fun world building stuff, or I can go do anything else with my life. Right before the next game, review my notes, be like, oh, right, then I'm doing this, this, and this. Okay, perfect. And not have to worry about all that extra stuff. Next one I have is the rules Gopher. I like this because it's an opportunity to take something that a lot of dungeon masters, game masters hate, which is a rules lawyer at the table, and turn them sort of into your ally. And have them as sort of a resource for your game. Have someone who's dedicated to looking up rules and interpretations so you're not pausing gameplay. And a great thing that a rules-minded person can do when it's not their turn is be like, hey, this person wants to do this, and you're like, I'm not sure if that spell does exactly what you're trying to do with it. So I'm going to make a call, and while I'm making the call, you, person over here, who I know knows the rules really well, will you go and find a actual written source for this interaction, what maybe the official ruling is. So I can send them off to do that. They can come back and be like, okay, well, apparently they want people be ruled this way. We'll keep that in mind and we'll do that for next time. Or it might be like, I don't really like that ruling. I want to keep it the way that I did it. Maybe you're gonna have to deal with a rules lawyer, but you probably knew that already if you have a rules lawyer at your table, honestly. So what you can do is kind of force them, if you have a really aggressive rules lawyer, to be like, okay, you need to go look up rules. And you can do that while we keep running the game. Instead of stopping the game and everybody pulling out books to start to look up the interpretation of a rule somewhere. Find Jeremy Crawford's tweet about it. And the next one is the Metagame Slapper, which can be really helpful. You give somebody at the table, it becomes their job to keep the group honest about the separation of sort of in-character and out-of-character knowledge. You want to make sure that you have people who are talking about what's going on in the scene, and maybe a whole bunch of those people aren't in the scene, and be like, hey, you don't know. You don't get to share this knowledge. You're not in the scene. You guys can't have this conversation. This is your character. You kind of have to make this decision on your own. Now, I'm kind of loosey-goosey with metagaming sometimes. Often I don't want a player and their character to make an ill-informed decision based off of something that I think the player doesn't know, but I think is reasonable that the character would know. And usually, even as a player, that's usually when I'll speak up and be like, hey, well, have you considered this, and this? So make sure you consider that as you're making this decision. Not being like, yes, you need to do this, or no, you don't need to do this. Try not to tell them what to do, but make sure that they have the information a person living in this shared world of our imagination would know and be able to make that call. That's an extra level of work that for me to stay on top of all the other stuff I'm doing as a dungeon master or game master, of trying to run the game and trying to make sure that characters are not sharing out of character information or bringing that out of character information into in-character information. Have somebody else at the table who maybe doesn't have as much to do, who's just listening to the conversations, who'd be like, hey, can you be the person who watches out for this and make sure that we don't do all that out of character, in character metagame. The other one that I have down here is the food and drinks Gopher. Well, I know I've played at a lot of tables where the physical space is just kind of limited. Sometimes you're playing in a table that's kind of in a corner somewhere, and it's not easy for somebody who's maybe the furthest into the corner, and the two people who are the furthest into the corner, to try to get out and around the table and get to the point where they can, grab a snack or grab drinks. Whoever the person is who's sitting the closest to the kitchen or snack machines, wherever you're playing, everybody at the table just kind of funnels their request to that person. Hey, can you go grab me another soda, another beer? Do we have any chips or things like that? Do we need more Mountain Dew? and you can send that person to go get your Mountain Dew for you. That is the trade-off. It's like picking a seat on the airline. If you want the aisle seat, if you want that extra leg room in the aisle, there are some responsibilities that come with that. If you're going to take advantage of being the person who sits on the outside, who's not maybe as cramped as some of the other players, then it kind of behooves you to be the person who is the person who goes and grabs drinks and snacks for them. And that way, it's only one person getting up to go get food and drinks, and it's not the entire table walking away to go do it, and then leaving only one or two people at the table just kind of twiddling their thumbs, kind of like, so dragons, huh? So instead, can kind of keep the game going while sending that one person off to kind of do that. Now, obviously, if it's the middle of a very important scene for their character, delay it, or delay those requests for a little bit. And the last one that I kind of have on here is the assistant GM or DM. So this is your assistant game master or dungeon master, kind of a transition. It's sort of like the old school caller, as well as somebody who probably is a pretty functional dungeon master or game master in their own right. So there's somebody who can answer questions directly from players, or they can help compile questions and ask the DM maybe the more specific question that they're trying to get an answer for, because especially when you play with people who are not super well versed in the system that you're playing, they're trying to figure out whether they can do something or how something works, but they're not always using the language of the game mechanics to do that. They're like, I want to do this thing, but I'm not sure I can do this thing. Can I do this thing with this thing at the same time? And do these two things interact in the way that I think they should? So that sort of assistant GM goes, yes, well, I don't believe so. I don't think that's going to work because of this reason as far as how the mechanics go. Or maybe that's kind of a judgment call. And then I can turn around and I can ask the DM a much more structured, simple question. Be like, hey, these two things work together? Because I think that maybe this thing and this thing work together, but I also can see that maybe these two things, parts of it, don't work together. What's your call on something like that? Where I can say it in a much more concise way. Also, the person you turn to as a dungeon master, if you have somebody at the table who is also fairly experienced DM and you trust their judgment and their ability to do things, they can actually help you manage large battles. If you have a bunch of mooks or minions that you're running through, you have a bunch of environmental hazards or layer actions or something like that, and you trust that this person's not going to metagame, then you can actually just take those things and give it to them. It's like, hey, do you mind running the goblins for this? There's so many goblins, and I've got a whole bunch of other stuff going on. Once the goblins' turn, will you just have them attack people? Because they're just mooks or minions. They don't have a lot of thought, built-in tactics or strategy. They just run in and try to stab things. So if you have things like that, or like, hey, here are the layer actions. When it comes around in the layer action, will you just take care of the layer action so that way I can focus specifically on running the boss? If you're using somebody who's got some experience running the game, they're going to make the right choices as far as when it comes to layer actions or how the monsters run or work and do those sorts of things. They've been in your position, so they understand what you're trying to do with these monsters pretty implicitly. I also think that this is a great role for any player that gets KO'd in a fight, or just straight up dies in a fight. If they're a character that gets KO'd, either they straight die or they get KO'd and they don't get revived by their next turn. They're like, hey, here are the zombies. You can run the zombies and kill your friends real quick. And now you have something to do for the next 15, 20 minutes that we're still playing out the battle. So it's not just, hey, it's your turn. I roll a d20. I got a 10. Great. Make a check on a past death save. And I'll wait another 10 minutes till it's my turn again. So instead, you can give them something to do, track during that combat, in a way that they can continue to play, even if they can't play their character. I felt like the players I've done that with appreciate that, the ability to still feel like they're part of it. And then, if sometimes you have somebody in the group who's not healing them, they can take their swift revenge on it with the mooks and minions that they run and attack their friends and try to kill them. Because if I'm gonna die, we're all gonna die. Yeah, and I'll do the same thing if it, even for non-combat things. You can grab a player who's if the party decides to split, they go in opposite directions. and you have somebody who's out of the scene, you can have them the stat block to have them to run and try to get revenge on their companions. Or maybe if you're running one of those weird scenes where you as the dungeon master have more than one NPC in the scene and they start talking to each other, you can script one of your friends at the table who's sitting next to you who's not in the scene and be like, hey, I need you to play this guy. just react it. You're just a yes man or stooge or whatever. So that way it's just not me talking to myself like, I think this is a good idea. I also think this is a good idea. Just because it's a little awkward to do as a dungeon master and a little funny to watch. But yeah, I mean, those are a handful of different ways, a lot of just common dungeon master duties that we take care of at the table that I feel like we could hand off. Some of these I've had more experience handing off than others, so it kind of depends. For most dungeon masters or game masters, you're going to find something within what we talked about that probably was a little light bulb for you that could be like, yes, that is something that I'm taking care of that literally anybody at the table could take care of. Have you used something like this before? Let me know sort of in the comments below. I think it's one of the things we rarely talk about in DM tips and advice, is that it's sort of the massive amounts of plates that we're kind of spinning when we're running games. It's really rare to find the tips and advice for getting these sorts of demands off our DM duties, because sometimes running a better game is not about the hottest new tool or app, but sometimes it's just about reclaiming some of your own brain power behind the screen to be able to focus on actually getting deeper and more enjoyable with the game, and not run as much of the sort of surface level tasks and things that just facilitate the game. Increase everybody's enjoyment just a little bit. Even if it's just a little bit, we can do that. I don't know how many times I've heard from players about sort of how bored they are between turns, especially in combat when it feels like you could do your turn and then you might be waiting 5, 10, sometimes even 15 minutes for your next turn in a big combat. Watch players as DM behind the screen kind of flip out their phones immediately when they're done with their turn, drift away and stop paying attention because it's no longer their turn. And so instead of giving them sort of that engagement to be able to kind of tuck in and be able to do things when it's not their turn that makes them feel proactive and engaged, give them something to do, and then they also feel this sort of sense of responsibility that they need to pay attention when it's not their turn. That stuff goes a long way to increasing overall player engagement in your games. That's it. That's my 2 cents. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys, and I'll see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.